seems that the angels would be very, in that text, they would be very interesting. This wouldn't be something that they pass by and laugh at.
Exactly. I think they're very compassionate observers. The book of Daniel talks about the idea of angels that observe, that are serving us. That's where the concept of guardian angels comes from. And I think this is kind of the New Testament equivalent of that. There's no indication that they're doing any intervention, but they're certainly interested observers. All right, let's move into chapter 5 then. Oh, you got it back up. Okay. We're going to look at chapter 5. If you remember, we've been talking about the idea of poor judgments. Chapters 4, 5, and 6 is a series of judgments that the church in Corinth that was making, that Paul is explaining they're doing it wrong. In chapter 4, they were making judgments that they should not be making. Judgments as to how effective somebody else is in their service to Christ. As we talked about, that's not their role to judge. They're to be judged by their master, which is Christ. And Paul even made the comment, he said, I don't need to judge myself in this area. I just simply do what I've been given to do. That's my role, that's my ministry. In chapter 5, we're really going to see this kind of flipped over. In chapter 5, we're going to see that the church in Corinth was not judging things that they should have been judging. And so Paul is going to deal with that. And in chapter 6, we're going to see where there was problems of the fact that they were using the wrong kind of judges, the wrong people to make judgments. But look here in chapter 5, Paul says it's actually reported among you. His language just seems to show astounding. He's just astounded that he's hearing this report. In fact, everything he's dealt with up to this point in the book has been things that have been reported to him. We would assume by Chloe's people that were mentioned back in chapter 1. And this is one where Paul is just saying, I'm astounded that you did this. I'm astounded that this is happening here. And he says that there is a type of immorality that exists among you that is not even named among the Gentiles. Now, again, remember, what Gentiles are we talking about here? These are there we go. These are the Gentiles that live in Corinth. Now, as we talked about at the beginning of the class, that maybe some of the reputation that is assigned to first century Corinth probably is something that actually applied a few centuries before that. But this certainly is not this is not the kind of place that you would say, well, this is the ideal situation where everybody lives the way they ought to live. And yet Paul says to the church there in Corinth, you have something going on among you that the Gentiles would not do. It's not named among them. Now, there is a story in Greek literature of this sort of situation where somebody was having a sexual relationship with their mother or stepmother. But the Greeks regarded that as being evil. In that story, whether it's true or not, it was regarded as being something evil. So that leads to the question, where did this church in Corinth come up? Well, where did they come up with this? I've got on the board here the sons of Israel. Who was the firstborn, the most important of the sons of Israel? We might think It was Joseph. Of course, Joseph was the favored son, but he was actually the 11th son. And Benjamin, his younger brother, the two that were born to Rachel. But of course, where's the Christ come? Well, it's Judah. So Judah must have been the firstborn, right? No, it wasn't Judah. Maybe Levi, the tribes of the priests. No, Levi was actually third. Look, if you would, in Genesis 35 and verse 22. There's a couple of stories in the genealogy, the narrative of the story of the life of Jacob. And there's a couple of stories in there. I call them almost throwaway stories. They're not really they're very important, but they're very short and they really don't follow the main narrative. They're kind of side stories. If somebody could read Genesis 35, verse 22, please. Yeah, Israel there being Jacob. So Reuben, the firstborn, what does he do? He does the exact same thing that we're reading about here in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. This is not a first century invention. It's not something that we can blame on the Greeks or the Romans. It's not something that's unknown to the Israelites. Book of Deuteronomy actually had a law that God had given about what to do with someone who did this, and it was death. God found it despicable. And that's why Reuben did not get the birthright. That one verse explains to us why the oldest and firstborn son did not get the birthright. There's another story that explains why Simeon and Levi, the second and third sons, do not get the birthright. We're not going to take the time to look at that, but I just wanted you to see that this sort of behavior that we identify with Corinth, that we identify with the Gentiles, we identify with the Greeks and the Romans, it predates them. God's people have been doing this kind of stuff for a long, long time. And God still finds it just as reprehensible as he did in the days of Israel. And so Paul says, I'm astounded. He's astounded by the fact that it happened. But what bothers him even more? Yeah, they tolerate. In fact, the church in Corinth does more than just simply tolerate this. What do? They accept it, they boast about it. They actually brag about the fact that this man is accepted within their fellowship, that this behavior is accepted within their fellowship. And that's what Paul says is not good. Talk about an understatement. This is not good, Paul says. In fact, it's just about as far the opposite from being good as it can possibly be. So in verse 3, what does Paul say he's going to do about that? Remember, Paul wrote this letter probably from Ephesus, a few hundred miles away from Corinth. But what's he say he's doing right now? Yeah, he says, I am judging this man. I'm judging this behavior. You see, even though I'm not with you in person, he says, I am with you in spirit. And I'm telling you that this behavior cannot be accepted. Again, that's difficult for us to fully comprehend because of what he had just said in the previous section. I don't even examine myself. It's a very little thing for you to examine it. let's see if we can start to kind of unpack the difference between what he said don't do in chapter 4 and what he's telling them they should do in chapter 5. And maybe to do that, we really need to go all the way back to chapter 2. In chapter 2, and in verses 10 and 11, actually verse 11 primarily, what does Paul tell us that we cannot know without some sort of revelation? Right, we cannot know the thoughts of God, nor who else. Yeah, we can't even know the thoughts of our neighbor unless they have in some way revealed that to us. Now, if we've lived with them for many years, we've had many conversations, we have an inkling of how they think. May even have a very good idea of how they think. But it's only because they have revealed the way they think to us already. But none of us can just look at somebody that we've never met before and say, I know what you're thinking. No, you don't. And we're the same nature. Does that help us to understand why Paul condemned their examination, their judgment in chapter 4? What were they judging about Paul there in chapter 4? Yeah, they were judging his apostleship. They were judging his style. They were judging even what his motives were. And that's what Paul says, I don't care about your judgments. That's not your role to do. But what about this man that we're talking about here in chapter 5? What is it that Paul is judging about him? His actions, his behavior. That's what Paul is condemning. He says this behavior cannot be accepted. These actions cannot be accepted. Notice he's not talking about what the man's motives are. What he's thinking in his heart, he's saying what he's doing is wrong. And you cannot tolerate that. You can't accept that. So when we go back here to chapter 5, when he says, I am judging him from afar, this is not Paul somehow reading this man's mind from Ephesus. Instead, he's reading the actions. And he says, these actions are wrong. And you cannot tolerate that. But then what does he say he's doing as he judges him? What is he doing? Essentially, he says, I'm doing with this man. He says he's delivering him. To whom and how is he delivering this man? Who's he being delivered to? To Satan. I don't know about you, but that kind of sends a chill through my spine. To deliver somebody to Satan. Let's see if we can unpack that a little bit. He says the purpose of delivering him to Satan is to destroy what? To destroy his flesh. But then what's the purpose of doing that? Yeah, to save his spirit. I'll tell you, delivering somebody to Satan, my first thought is that's going to save their spirit. That's not the first thing I'm thinking about. But that's exactly the point that Paul is making here. So that kind of helps us to modify and understand what he means by delivering to Satan to destroy his flesh. And again, we kind of have to look at the context of what Paul has already been talking about. Let's go back to some other passages that we've already looked at. Chapter 1 and verse 26. So somebody could read that, please. Chapter 1 and verse 26.
Consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble.
What did the flesh signify there in that verse? Not many who are wise according to the flesh. What's the flesh talking about there? I think that's a very good. That's essentially what the flesh means there. That which is of the world. Chapter 3 and verse 3. Another place where he uses that same word. Somebody could read that, please. Okay, so what's the flesh mean in that verse? Yeah, to be thinking in a worldly, thinking, using the ESV version from before, worldly standards. The flesh, as Paul has been using it here, is not talking about literally the physical body, but more what it means symbolically. It means to live according to the flesh, to be guided by the flesh, to be controlled by the flesh. So when Paul says to destroy the flesh, is this man going to die when he delivers him over to Satan? Not literally, physically. What's he trying to destroy? Yeah, the way that he's thinking according to the flesh. This man obviously is doing this because of the fact he's fleshly thinking. And so Paul says, I deliver him over to Satan. We'll talk in a moment about what that means. That his fleshly guidance or his fleshly control will be destroyed. Now, does that start to make sense when we talk about the idea of saving his spirit? I think in the same context, we need to recognize spirit isn't necessarily, this isn't talking about just the day of judgment. But in fact, it's set in contrast to the flesh. There's always this battle going on with the child of God. Satan is trying to get us to think according to the flesh. The Holy Spirit is trying to get us to think according to the Spirit. And so what Paul is essentially saying is, he needs to be judged in his behavior for the purpose of destroying the control of the flesh so that the Spirit can live within him. So the Spirit can take control of his life. So then what does it mean to deliver over to Satan? And I think this takes us really even to the very last verse of the chapter. What is it Paul tells that church to do? In no uncertain terms. Remove the wicked man from among you. In one of our very first classes, when we were talking about the idea of the fellowship that we have with Christ, we talked about what it means, this idea of fellowship. And again, what's the literal meaning? Anybody remember? What is the meaning of fellowship? Don't tell me we got to go back to class 1. Sharing together. So they, as a community of believers in Corinth, are sharing together. So when Paul says, remove that wicked man from among yourselves, what does that mean? Yeah, they're no longer sharing with him. He's not to be a part of what they share together. In Colossians chapter 1, Paul says that we have been transferred from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of his beloved Son. When we become children of God, God has taken us out of the world And through the blood of Christ has cleansed us that we can be a part of that kingdom. God, of course, does that on what we would call a universal basis. God determines who's a part of his kingdom. But in every local community of believers, what do they have to do? Yeah, they essentially have to do the same to the very best of their ability. They have to recognize those who are part of their community, and then they have to recognize those who are not. And we're going to see that here in chapter 5 and again in chapter 6. Paul's going to emphasize this distinction between these two worlds. And I think it begins here. When he says, I decided to deliver him over to Satan, Paul is saying, from my perspective, he's no longer a part of that community. And then he tells them, that's what you need to do, is you need to remove him from your community. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? If you've ever talked with people in the world, some denominations, about the fact that there's times where we have to exclude someone from our fellowship, generally the reaction is kind of, well, that's pretty harsh. Don't you love them? Absolutely we do. Did Paul love this man? Absolutely he loved it. He made it clear his purpose is to save his spirit, to let him once again be guided by the Spirit as he was at one time. When Peter told Simon, I see that you're in the gall of bitterness and the bond of iniquity. Was that harsh? Was it loving? Absolutely. When someone is being guided by the flesh, and we can tell by their actions, they're being guided by the flesh, the most loving thing that we can do for them is to point that out. And if as a community, we recognize that that person and their actions as they are now are not being guided by the Spirit, but being guided by the flesh, then we as a community need to do what Paul told the church in Corinth to do. Now, does that mean that everybody who's made a fleshly decision that we need to do that? Well, I go back to chapter 3 and verse 3. What did Paul say there? He said, you're men of flesh. I guess they just have to exclude everybody, don't they? Now, these were people who were struggling with that temptation we talked about earlier. And Paul's pointing that out to them. He's not ignoring it. But he's not saying remove everybody who's ever made a bad choice, a fleshly choice. But this man's gone to the point where Paul says, you have to do that with him. Now, let's go on and talk about why that's so important. And I've been falling behind. I talked about there being pride and their tolerance. That's the question. When did we get into the 21st century? That seems to be the thing today, how proud we are of how tolerant we are. And again, that's not a new invention of this century. What's the danger? Okay, I mean, I can see the danger for this man. He continues in his behavior, continues to be guided by the flesh. I see the danger for him. But Paul goes on to tell them there's more than just him that you need to consider. What else is a danger?
Big danger would be them being around and influenced by his immorality and them not realizing how far they're straying from purity, from, righteous living. I think about Malachi in the 3rd chapter. God deals with that, and that overarching question that Israel always responds to God with, and through the text is, how God have we done this?
Yes.
And in verse 7, they say, but the Lord knows, but you say to him, how shall we return? And I see that in that they had allowed so much to get involved in all this immorality that they didn't realize how far in the base they had become.
Yeah.
And they got farther and farther away from him.
And it's interesting you mentioned Malachi, because my mind has started at the other end, at the very beginning of Israel. And what that illustrates is that this was something that Israel dealt with throughout all of their history. From the time they crossed the Red Sea, right after celebrating the Passover, we find that there were people who started grumbling and complaining and leading rebellion away from God. And what did that do to the rest of the community? Korah's rebellion, what was it? 22,000 people died from that. Just so many examples over and over again. Achan at Jericho, one man secretly stole some things. And yet what happened to Israel? We have to understand that that sort of influence and behavior, as Doug pointed out, that affects the entire community. Interestingly, Paul used this idea of the Passover. He said, don't you understand that a little bit of leaven does what? Yeah, it leavens the whole lump. For the Passover, what was it the people of Israel had to do the day before? They had to get all the leaven out, even to the point where they had to sweep their houses to get all of the leaven out of the house. Because this was a time to be pure in the sight of God. They had to purify themselves to be able to serve. They had to be pure to be able to serve God. That's essentially what Paul is telling the church in Corinth. To be able to serve God there in Corinth, and it's not just one day out of the year, but essentially all the time, they had to be, as he says, unleavened. He makes an interesting point here. It's a fascinating metaphor that has far more highly reaching values than we can talk about this evening. Who is our Passover? Christ is our Passover. And so this man's behavior, ultimately, what is Paul saying that is doing? Yeah, it's ruining the rest of them. It's even ruining their Passover. What kind of lamb were they supposed to use for the Passover lamb? Unblemished. Christ was beyond all unblemished. And yet this man's behavior is bringing a blemish on Christ. And now we start to understand why this is not harsh. This is appropriate. Because this has to do with how holy Jesus is to every one of us. How pure we must be to be able to serve him. That's the point that Paul wants them to understand about this. So finally in verse 9, we find here that apparently Paul had written a previous letter. So 1 Corinthians apparently wasn't actually 1 Corinthians. It's the first one recorded by the Holy Spirit. But Paul had actually written on this idea to them previously. And apparently what had happened is some of the people there in Corinth had said, yeah, we understand where Paul says immorality is something that we need to stay away with. And you know what? This city is filled with immoral people, and we're going to shun all of them. We're not going to have anything to do with any of them. But it has nothing to do with our own community. Paul says, no, you're not getting the point at all. That's not what I was saying. In fact, Paul goes on to point out, he says, Wish I could keep up with that. This idea of association, I meant to spend just a couple of moments on that. The word that is translated association there is related to the word synagogue. Now, this particular word, this is the only time it's used in the New Testament, but it is related to the word for synagogue. And it means a place where things are mixed up together. Very similar to fellowship, sharing together. And yet that's why Paul says, do not associate with this brother. He goes even to say, not even to eat with such a one. So many times people focus just on the eating. Now, I will argue that the Bible teaches, both Old and New Testament, that eating a meal together is more than just simply getting nutrition at the same time. There, in fact, is some significance, a pretty important significance about families who eat together, friends who eat together, people that we share a meal together. There is some symbolic importance in that. But that's not the only thing that Paul was talking about here when he says, do not associate with such a one. I've seen it to the point where people would say, well, sure, we can spend time together just so long as we don't eat any popcorn. We'll go to the movie, but we can't order popcorn because you're not in fellowship with us anymore. I don't know if you can get any more Pharisaic than that. Paul is talking about the fact that you no longer consider them as somebody that you're sharing your lives together with. And then he just says, even to the point where you don't eat together. Because it's not somebody that you're brought into your sharing. Again, that distinction in lives, and we will expand on that quite a bit more as we get into the latter part of chapter 5 and the first part of chapter 6, the distinction in those worlds. But let me go back now to verse 9. Who do we judge? We've seen that they weren't judging what they should have been judging, so who are they supposed to be judging? But Paul says, when I wrote this letter, I was not talking about the world. Again, we've got our distinctions. It is not the role of Christians, the Christian community, to look out to the world and say, you all we're not going to have anything to do with you. In fact, I think Paul is making the argument all through chapter 5 and chapter 6. You don't really have anything to do with them anyway. They're not in your fellowship. So you're not judging them. So then who are we judging? Those who are in our fellowship. Those are the ones that we are looking at the behavior. Again, distinguish between I'm judging your motives, I'm judging what you're thinking, and to judge what they're doing. And that's where Paul says you have to look at what's going on among you. What have I to do with judging outsiders? God will take care of that. But in verse 13, he says, but those who are outside, God judges, or excuse me, the last part of verse 12, do you not judge those who are within? The word church there is added by the translators. He's just simply saying those who are inside. You judge those who are inside. Those who are outside, God will judge. And then he says, remove the wicked man from among yourselves. Now again, keep in mind, to what purpose? So the purpose is to destroy the fleshly man, that the spiritual man can live. Anybody have any questions or comments about what we covered today? All right, next week I'm going to be out of town. Dempsey is arranging somebody to teach. I don't know whether it's going to be him or somebody else, but Dan's going to be teaching. Okay, so Dan will be teaching next week. Are you going to pick up then here, Jeff? I was gonna kind of review a little bit of chapter 5 and then get it on into chapter 6. Okay. So anyway, Dan will be teaching next week while I'm out of town. Thank you.